Good morning and welcome to the Teagasc Boer Malt Winter Malting Barley webinar. My name is Michael Hennessy. I'm the head of the Crops Knowledge Transfer in Teagasc. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Richie Hackett from Teagasc, Eoin Lyons from Teagasc and Boer Malt Joint Programme, and Tom Bryan from Boer Malt. Good morning and you're very welcome, everyone. So this is a very short webinar that will deal with the most recent research data and the malt and barley varieties in or around the yields and nitrogen. And Richie Hackett is going to cover that area. We're joined on video by John Crowley, a farmer in Wexford, who will give us a flavour of his on-farm experiences of growing winter malting barley. And then Tom Bryan will chat to us at the end just about varieties and the availability of varieties and how the market is looking for the coming season. So look, don't forget to ask questions along the way as we go. The Q&A tab is on the bottom of your screen, so just pop it in and pop in a question at any time, and we'll do our best to answer those questions before the end of the webinar. Because this is a relatively short webinar, we probably should be finished in around a half an hour or so. We will keep the questions to the very end, and we'll try and answer them all then. So we're going to go straight into the talks. Richie, if you're ready to go, I'm going to try and hand over to you and you might just present your bits and pieces there. Okay.
Thanks, Michael, for that. So I'm just going to give as Michael said, I'm just going to give a very brief update on a trial that we did funded by Boer Malt in the past season, looking at winter malting varieties of barley. And I suppose, why do we do it? Obviously, there's growing interest in winter malting barley from both the grower's point of view and the maltster's point of view. But there hasn't been a whole pile of research in the specific area of winter malting under our conditions. So we established this trial last autumn. And we're basically comparing malting and potential malting varieties at different levels of nitrogen to see, do different varieties, well, to see how the different varieties compare to one another, and then to see, do they differ in their nitrogen requirements. So the varieties we had were Craft and Electrum, which many of you will be familiar with, two established malting varieties in the UK and have been grown for a couple of years here in Ireland as well. Vessel is another potential malting variety of interest in that it's a non-GN variety, so it potentially opens up the distilling market to winter malting. And then we had Gio, which some of you might be familiar with from just commercial growing, which was being looked at as a potential variety. We had a numbered variety from the same stable as Gio. We got as a numbered variety. It's since been named as a KWS Fearless, but I'll refer to it by its numbers through the presentation. And then we included Valerie as sort of a non-malting variety, just from comparison, a commercial variety for comparison. And we compared each of these varieties at 4 different levels of nitrogen, from 135 kilos per hectare up to 180 kilos per hectare. The crop was sown as a second crop after wheat. The wheat was grown after a break crop. Medium texture soil. We sowed it the 13th of October, which we sorted about when we sowed most of our winter barley trials. Seed rate was 350 seeds per square metre for all the varieties, same seed rate for all varieties. And in terms of applying the nitrogen, we applied it as can in 2 equal applications, first on the 3rd of March and the second on the 24th of March. And then everything else, all the other sprays and pesticides were common across all the treatments. Just before we go through the results, I would say this about any trial, that just looking at one site in one season is always very, very dangerous. You have to be very careful with what interpretation you take out of it. But as we'll see in a few moments, it's of particular relevance this year, because the response to nitrogen in winter barley seems to have been a bit unusual in the current season. So we just need to note that as we go through. In terms of yield, what do we got? We got reasonable yields. So yields sort of range between 9 and about 11 tons per hectare, depending on the amount of nitrogen. Obviously, yields increased as we went from the low rate up to the high rate of nitrogen. Normally, you might expect yields to start to level off when you're getting close to 180 kilos or thereabouts. In the current season, that didn't seem to happen. if you look carefully at the graphs, you might say, well, there seems to be some difference in that the likes of Vessel seems to have leveled off, whereas the likes of, say, Electrum didn't. But when we did the stats on it, that didn't seem to be a real effect, but there was definitely some trends there. The two 6-row varieties, I should have said that numbered variety is actually a 6-row variety. So Gio and the numbered variety were both 6-row varieties. That tended to give the highest yield of the varieties. And if we just look at the next slide, we have all the average of each variety averaged over the 4 nitrogen rates. And as you can see, there wasn't, when we averaged them over the 4 nitrogen rates, there wasn't a huge difference in the yield between them. We were going from just under 10 tons per hectare up to about 10.6 tons per hectare. I would say these are all plot yields. Obviously, in field yields, you might expect slightly lower yields. But when we look at the relative yields, so that the red numbers on the top of the graph, we can see that, yes, there was differences, but there wasn't huge differences. I suppose the one thing that was interesting, that if anyone that has studied the current recommended list, which has both Valerie and Jayu on it, the relative ranking of those is almost identical to the current recommended list. So that would give us some confidence that, you know, it's a reasonably representative trial in terms of comparing the different varieties to one another. But again, obviously it's one site in one season. I suppose in terms, this is just getting back to what I said about 2021 maybe being an unusual season. So this is just nitrogen response curves from another trial that we've been doing over the past 4 years. This was done actually with Cosmos. And we've had it on sort of the same rotational slot and similar soil type over the past 4 years. And this particular trial, it wasn't a malting trial. We're just going purely a feed trial, and we've gone up to 260 kilos per hectare on the nitrogen. And if you look at all the years except the red line, which is 2021, you generally find that the yield is starting to level off. You know, some are either side of 200 kilos per hectare, and it's 2019, you'd argue it started maybe about 160 kilos per hectare, whereas in 2021 we're still increasing quite strongly, even up to 260 kilos per hectare. So as I said, 2021 in terms of nitrogen response seems to have been quite unusual. And as I said, this 2021 trial was done in the same field right beside the actual malting trial. So just to be careful that we don't interpret too much into these results. In terms of protein, I think any of you that have grown malting barley this year will have known that it was a low protein year, and it was quite a low protein year in terms of this trial as well. So our proteins, if we look at the red dotted bar there on the different graphs, that's sort of the 9.5, which is sort of typically the bottom of the brewing category and the top of the distilling category. We can see that the vast majority of the varieties, apart from, ironically enough, Vessel, which is sort of one that would be looking towards distilling, they were all below the 9.5 and considerably below 9.5 at the lower nitrogen rate. Even if we look at the 180 kilos per hectare rate, none of them quite reached the 9.5. So you might say, well, we need to put a lot more nitrogen on our crops next year. But that would be really, really not the thing to do. So when I look back at the previous trial with the Cosmos that I spoke about, when we looked at the proteins in that, and if you'd put 180 kilos on in that particular trial over the past 3 years, you would have failed on the high side. You'd have been above 10.8 in 2 of the years, and you would have been fairly close to the upper limit of the brewing specification in the other year. 2021 was a low protein year and not necessarily representative of what would happen in future dates. So the wrong message to take from this would be that you can put 180 or more than 180 kilos on your barley and not have any problems with protein. In a normal year, you could end up with very significant failures on protein with high rates of nitrogen. But again, it's obviously only one site in one season. So conclusions, as I said, you need to be very careful drawing any conclusions from it because of A, it's just a single site, and obviously we have that issue with the very unusual nitrogen response in 2021. But I think the tentative conclusion would be that there's not very big differences between varieties in terms of their nitrogen response. In other words, maybe there's not any great need to have different nitrogen rates for different varieties. And in terms of the varieties themselves, yes, there seems to be small differences between them, but they don't seem to be, based on this particular trial, they don't seem to be really, really big differences. So I think with that, Michael, I'll hand back to you.
Richie, thanks very much. That was great, very short and concise. And look, it really does, I suppose, highlight the problems, as you said yourself there, around the 1 year's data and the value of having at least 3 years data, and probably 3 years data for multiple sites is would give a very much a stronger data set. Okay, Richie, what we'll do is there is a couple of questions after coming in there. We're going to hold them, as I say, until the very end, until everyone's kind of finished talking. So we're going to come back to you there in a few minutes. So in the meantime, before we get to Eoin Lyons, we're going to go to a short video which Eoin made with John Crowley. And John Crowley's a farmer from Wexford. And John is going to chat to Eoin around his experiences growing winter malt and barley over the last number of years. So can we roll the...
I'm here today just outside the town of Ferns in County Wexford. I'm just going to have a quick chat with John Crowley, who's a participant as a monitor farmer as part of the Board Malt Train programme. I'm just going to get a bit of insight into why John grows winter malt and barley on the farm. So the first question I put to John is why, firstly, he decided to grow winter malt about 3 years ago.
I'd say the biggest thing was after 2018, which was a pretty much disaster, was to try and spread the risk with getting the harvest in. So by having winter malt allowed me to get some of my grain into malt in July before the main push of the harvest in August, just really spreading the risk of it.
So John, you said there that you started growing winter malt about 3 years ago on the farm, but can you just tell us what varieties you've grown on the farm since then?
I've had Craft and Pixel, were two varieties I've had. Craft, I wouldn't have gone great with, I think, but it was possibly to do with site selection, hash winter, and I'd say if I was to grow Craft again, I would try and maybe get a little bit sooner and get a little bit of air nitrogen out onto it as soon as possible to get up and going. Pixel yielded fantastically. It was a really nice crop. Unfortunately, it didn't meet the spec in malting, so it was discontinued.
Yeah, look, I suppose you've been growing winter feed barley on the farm for a number of years now, but is there any key differences that you see between growing winter malt barley versus winter feed from your experience?
The main advantage, I'd say, especially now with the price of fertiliser, is you can cut back on fertiliser quite a bit, up to 30 units the acre, which is a major advantage, I say, now with the price of fertiliser. Apart from that, it's fairly similar. I know with Lyons Craft maybe go a little bit extra seed per acre. Really, it's quite similar. Apart from that, it helps mitigate the risk of with your modelling varieties or getting your contract filled as well.
And last year here in the farm we had a bit of a demo with 5 different potential varieties and some varieties out there at the moment with winter malts. But how did you think they performed on the farm, or what variety stood out for you maybe as a potential going forward?
I suppose Election was the one that stood the best. Again, there was a good range in it. Many had their benefits. Probably Election though was the one that stood out as of those trials being the best amongst that batch.
That's great. Thanks very much, John. It was great to get that insight from John. It was short, but in fairness, John is one of the best malt and barley growers out there, and he tends to get everything over the line pretty much. So, Eoin, you were interviewing John, and we're going to turn it back across to you, Eoin. You're the program advisor for the joint Teagasc Boer Malt joint program, and you're going to give us a little bit more of an insight about the wider experience of growers from across the Southeast region for the last couple of years. So, Eoin, I'll hand across to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, so look, as Michael said there, I'm just going to give a quick update on, what we've learned so far and where we've come as regards winter malting barley, and just maybe elaborate on some of the details that John gave there as part of the video. So firstly, just a bit of background, I suppose, for people who mightn't have much experience with winter malting barley. And as look, traditionally, when we talk about winter malt, we were, I suppose, referring to a spring variety that was drilled in the autumn as winter malt. And there is some growers still practicing this, but I suppose very limited to very free draining type soils, very kind type farms. So it's limited as regards the amount of growers that can actually grow a spring variety in the autumn. So when we talk about winter malts, we're talking about true winter barleys as part of the presentation. So look, the first crops were drilled in autumn 2018, and the varieties that were grown were Craft, which is a 2-row, which had been around in the UK for a number of years, and also Pixel, which is a 6-row, which at the time was only a relatively new variety. And look, I suppose the reason that Bournemouth looked into winter malts was, I suppose, to spread risk for growers and to try and increase the tonnage of malt delivered and increase the amount of contracts that were being filled on the ground. And John kind of alluded to that in the video where he talked about 2018 being a very poor year for barley with drought conditions, and it was very difficult to fill malting contracts. So it just spreads that bit of risk. It's another crop being harvested at a different time, and try and increase the amount of tons getting across the line. So these are just a few pictures of Craft and Pixel, and anyone who's growing Craft will recognize the picture on the left because it does stand out with its purple tinted awns. And then you can see then the Pixel is the 6-row there in the other picture. So I just want to give some details as regards how the harvest in 2019, 2020, the first 2 years of the winter malts went. And these are results from monitor crops that I would have had on different farms across the southeast during the 2 years. So you can see there in 19, it was a very good yielding year for winter barley generally, and Pixel, yielded extremely well. But you can see a large protein range from 8 up to the limit of 10.8, but the majority came in under that 10.8, the cutoff mark. As we see, Craft, I suppose, a small bit below where we had thought the yield might be. We thought it might be closer to one of the 2-row feeding barleys, but still respectable 8.9 tons a hectare. And as you can see, and again, the protein range maybe not quite as big, but still a large range there in relation to protein. I suppose just to explain that, the reason behind it was, there was probably a large variation in nitrogen applied, and Richie kind of showed that in his presentation that, there is a cutoff as regards what extra nitrogen is going to do for yield versus just an increase in protein. So I suppose going forward, we were looking into more tailored nitrogen approaches compared to maybe just sticking at a nitrogen rate similar to a winter feeding barley. Harvest 2020 then, I suppose, a difficult year for our winter barley, and yields, were considerably down on both Pixel and Craft, but probably not too far off where a lot of feeding barleys were also. And again, protein range that bit higher and a lot of failures that year. But really, I suppose it comes back to again, maybe too much nitrogen being applied, but also, you see there a lower yield, so the dilution factor, I suppose, wasn't there in the varieties also. So two factors contributing to the high proteins in 2020. So look, the main outcomes that we saw from the first 2 years was that Pixel, there was good yield and protein, but unfortunately, when it came to malt and the variety, it just wasn't up to the standard required by the maltster. So unfortunately, it had to be discontinued. Craft, fairly sure that it would be a good variety when it went to the maltings, because it had been Malting Barley in the UK for a number of years. But we saw that it did have excellent grain quality and a lot of grains per ear. And the yield potential was there to have good yield potential, but maybe we saw that it was slightly below average when it came to stacking up against maybe the other 2-row feeds. And one observation that we made was that its capacity to tiller and produce a high level of ears come harvest time maybe was a bit off where we like. And what we did then going forward, and I'll show on the next slide, is ways to try and examine how we might improve this. And then finally, like I mentioned, I suppose a more tailored approach to nitrogen applications there was some very high N rates used, and although it wasn't giving anything really extra in relation to yield, it was just driving up protein and bringing the protein level over the limit and causing the grain to fail. So just looking at the kraft seeding rates then, and aim to increase the performance of kraft in the field in order to increase yield of the crop. So we looked at 3 rates. We looked at the recommended rate as per 1,000 grain weight. We then upped that by 10% and by 20%. And we had 5 different sites then across the southeast. But I suppose just to make the point that these are very much on-farm demos rather than replicated trials. So it's really an observation just to see, can we improve it out on farm. So look, these are the results that we've seen as part of our seeding rate demo. So across, and these are the average of the results across our 5 different sites. So our average sowing date there was October 14th. And as you can see, the first one seeding rate there is 175 kilos, which is recommended based on our 1,000 grain weight. That was given a year number there of 780 per meter squared. Up that by 10% is a seeding rate of 193 kilos, up to 830 ears. And then again, our final one, plus 20%, a seeding rate of 210 kilos. And again, our year number is again increased up to 940. So I think it's clear to see there that, by increasing our seeding rate, we definitely are increasing the amount of ear number per meter squared that's being achieved from the crop. But just to make the point, and I mentioned it previously, that kraft, it has an excellent quality grain and it has a large number of ears per meter squared. And one observation that we saw from these demos was that by increasing by 20%, okay, we were getting a higher ear number at 940, but we were losing the size of the grain and also the amount of grains per ear. And that was then having a knock-on effect, or would have a knock-on effect in the field situation in relation to the quality of grain, and would affect the malting ability of the grain. So really, the outcomes that we could take from the demo was that by increasing by 10%, it was a happy medium between increasing our ear number, but also maintaining the grains per ear and also the size of the grain. So we're getting a nice balance between yield and maintaining the quality of the grain. And this is just a picture just to show the demo. And I know there's not much to see here from the 2 pictures, but it just gives an indication of what the type of demo that we're carrying out is. So it's very much, it's on farm and it's field based. So finally then, just some key points in relation to winter malted barley that I have come across in the past few years of growing the crop. And firstly, I'd say is to increase the kraft seeding rate by 10% from the recommended to try and increase our ear number and in turn increase yield. As Richie would have pointed out, decreasing N rate from winter malt varieties versus our winter feeds is also vital, in order to try and get our grain within spec. Tiller survival, I suppose, is very important. We alluded to kraft being a poor tiller, so we need to get in and feed the crop early and make sure that we keep all the tillers that are there. And finally, I suppose what I would have noticed that the winter malts and kraft in particular, that they don't take stress very well. And I suppose going forward with all winter barleys, we'll have to be conscious of trying to avoid stress on the crop. But I think just even more so on kraft, just to be that much more aware when applying herbicide or PRGRs, that it is that bit softer maybe than other varieties, and stress will have to be avoided where possible. Okay, thanks, Michael.
That's great, Eoin. Thanks very much. It's great to get that kind of overall overview from across the country and lots of different crops around the country. So again, there is a few questions there, but we're going to hold them just for a couple of minutes. We're next going to go to Tom Bryan from Bournemouth. Tom, if you stick on your camera and bits and pieces there. Tom, you're going to say a few words around the varieties, the seed availability this year, and perhaps a little bit about the prospects for malt for the coming year. So Tom, I'll hand across to you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Yeah, so the varieties going forward for the 22 crop, if we look at the winter, we will have Kraft, Electrum and Vessel. They're nearly all booked to date. The supply is there, but it's very, very tight. We weren't expecting so much of it to be sown this autumn, so the area has increased, but we have enough to cover everyone's needs, but it's just thereabouts. In relation to the spring, the main variety, about 50% of the barley will be planet, say 25% laureate and 25% tungsten, something like that. So they're the three main varieties. We will have some test varieties out there, small quantities of Skyway, maybe SY Amity, Geraldine, Splendor, but they will be just very, very small batches in various areas just to get a taste for how they actually work amongst the growing area. In relation to Harvest 22, so that's Harvest 22 is, we are predicting our malt production for the year of 23. So it's a little bit of a crystal ball. Hopefully the COVID situation will have relented furthermore by then, and we would expect to have the factory here in Athy in full production for the season of 2023. So that's January 23 to December 23. If that's the case, which I have no reason to suspect that it won't be the case, we will need approximately 180,000 tons of malting barley at, well, that's at 65 kph. So it changes versus the kph level, but all in all, it should be in around that, which is maxing out the plant capacity. On the production going forward, there was some interesting things there that Eoin alluded to in his presentation, and we're seeing that amongst all the samples. So throughout the harvest, we would have about 8,000 samples of malting barley tested, and we would see patterns or trends. So this year, the winter malting barley was low protein relative to the other seasons that we've seen it. But likewise, the spring barley. But in relative terms, the spring barley was about 1% lower than the winter malting barleys across the board. So it's just an interesting thing. It's a bit like a band in a graph, and this year it was a very low band. Next year it could be high. It depends on the sowing date and weather conditions and growth throughout the season. So it's highly variable, and I would concur with Richie and Eoin that you have to be really, really careful with the amount of nitrogen applied. We have seen this in other seasons where we've had a super low protein season, and people believe that they could go back and put a lot of nitrogen on the crops the following year. And that following year turned out to be a very high protein levels and super high rejection rates. So if there's any word of warning or word to the wise, I'd like to say is that, you know, whatever you did this year on the crops, if people could do work similarly, so if they could get sowing in the spring early, if at all possible, if they get the nitrogen on early, if they use similar type rates, not excessive rates of nitrogen on the crops, hopefully that will augur good for next year's harvest. But just to be really super careful, because generally after a low protein season, we get a highish protein season, and that would lead to rejections. Just to go on to rejections, this year we had about 5% in total. It was the lowest rejection rate that I have seen in my 33 years working with the company. So this was a super low protein harvest with extraordinarily low rejection rates. So, you know, it is well done to everyone out there that grew malting barley. And I think, Michael, that probably covers anything I have to say on the crops. Okay, that's great, Tom. Thank you very much. I might just invite Richie and Eoin just back in here again. We just have a few questions coming through. Tom, there's one, I suppose maybe it's probably pitched around, probably for you, I suppose, in a sense that the question's around, is there a low protein issue for distilling market? So I suppose obviously distilling is lower than brewing, but is it too low to a degree? Yeah, so as I said already, this year is probably the lowest protein year on average that we had. There was no load of barley rejected for low protein. Can there be an issue? Of course, there can be an issue. If you look at it, if we make the malt out of super low protein barley, the amount of protein or free amino nitrogens available to feed the yeast might be down a little bit. So the production in the distillery, which is the first part of production of distillery, is that you brew and then you distill. So the brewing element could be a little bit affected by low proteins, but there's ways around it. We would always take the proteins in bands. We store them separately. We malt them and then blend the malt. So reality is that no, we can't foresee any reason why there'd be a low protein issue with malting barley.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Richie, can I come across to you? Eoin mentioned a little bit along the way there. Obviously, craft is probably one of the biggest varieties out there, but it does have a bit of an issue with regards holding on to the, I suppose, tillers, or maybe having a high head count towards the end of the year. Would there be anything that you would suggest or that you might be inclined to do differently with that variety in comparison to others, maybe around early season nitrogen or that kind of thing?
Well, I suppose firstly, we didn't in the trial that we had this year, we didn't notice craft being, it didn't stand out as being having less ears or whatever. But I guess it's really managing. Well, I suppose make sure that your basic nutrition is correct, your P's and your K's and your limes, because if they're not right, that's going to start knocking tillers. And then obviously the nitrogen. I mean, I wouldn't be advising people going out in middle of February to put nitrogen on it to try and get it to tiller. It's more about, the problem from what I see seems to be more about sustaining the tillers, which, I would say, sort of early mid-March and then again before growth stage 31, get your nitrogen, have all your nitrogen on before growth stage 31 and sustain the tillers.
Okay, keep it fed then really right from the start. Okay, Eoin, just a quick question there on the variety, on the slot. What's the ideal slot, do you think, for the winter malting barley varieties?
Yeah, I've seen it put in even as a first barley, say after beans, and really it's just about managing about what nitrogen you think might be in the field, and try and tailor your nitrogen approach to that. But I suppose, look, an ideal slot would be similar to spring malt and barley, maybe, trying to avoid where there might be challenges as relation to excess nitrogen in the soil that might come through and affect protein, and maybe somewhere out in the slot might be that bit better. But I don't think I've seen it in after break crops as well, and it's just about managing your proteins, and I think it'll be fine.
Would there be any problems, Eoin, just in terms of putting it in after a spring barley crop where the volunteers might be coming through, do you think?
I don't see an issue there, no, I don't think.
Okay. Great, Tom. Just one there for you. You mentioned specifically KPH there as you were going through. Is there any changes coming to that in the year coming?
No, we will still be operating on a 62 kph minimum. So the new factory or the new plant operates on a volumetric basis. So it's really super important that we get a high kpH in the barley. So we've asked the various agents representing the breeders to concentrate on bringing forward varieties that have obviously good agronomic ability, the yield, everything else, but also have the higher kpH levels naturally within their genetics. So that's an area that we want to move forward with. I think there's a variety in the winter called Somerset, which seems to be fulfilling that, and one that might be there, not 22, but autumn 22, we might have some of it to see if we can produce it. But it just helps to reduce the rejection rate if we can keep it up in good quality.
Okay. Richie, just one, coming back to you there, one for you. You're obviously doing quite a bit of other research work in terms of winter barley anyway. Did you see any other agronomic issues with the winter malting varieties in comparison to maybe some of the other feeds that are more commonly grown?
No, as I say, we would have given them all our standard program for our feed barleys as we put on the malting barleys, and nothing really stood out as being unique to the winter varieties versus the winter malting varieties versus the winter feed varieties. I would say they're pretty much the same. The only difference you obviously would be, you'll be putting less nitrogen on them.
Okay, great. Eoin, just coming back to you for a second, you mentioned there about being, I suppose, easy on the crops because they're a little bit on the softer side. Do you have any experience about particular areas that were problematic that you noticed over the last couple of years in terms of what people were doing agronomically to these crops?
Yeah, I suppose in relation to PGRs will be the first one that might stick out. We're probably on as John Crowley mentioned in the video there, he's probably working on about 30 units less than an acre of nitrogen versus his feed crops. So already you probably have a less of an issue in relation to keeping the crop standing and your PGR approach. So I would say there's definitely opportunity there to try and reduce the amount of PGRs going on the crop versus your feed barley for that reason. But I've seen where, where some people have maybe gone with a high level of nitrogen and they have to go with then the full rate of PGRs after that, from a straw strength point of view. And it has definitely had an effect, I think, on tiller survival or, trying to produce the number of years, I should say, come harvest time.
Okay. And there's a standard question here, Eoin, just as regards the application of chlormequat early in the season to retain tillers. Did you do any demos or demonstrations or trials on that? And Richie might have a comment on it afterwards as well.
We don't have any demos as of yet on that, but hopefully, next season, I think it's something that was probably highlighted over the past 3 seasons. So hopefully going forward into next season, we'll have something on that as well, just to demo what our crop was.
Okay. Richie, any comment on it?
Yeah, it's not something I've ever really looked at. I think when you look into the literature, there can be some small effects, but tend to be somewhat unpredictable.
Okay. All right. Eoin, you've seen a good bit of winter, I suppose, spring varieties sown in the autumn. Question here around the recommended sowing date for putting laureate in the autumn or the winter, if you like, for winter sown laureate.
Yeah, so I think it would be that bit later than what you'd be going to say with your true winter barleys, if you want to call it. So, you could be towards, let's say, the 3rd, 4th week of October. And again, it goes back to what I mentioned in the presentation there about getting your site correct for, say, laureate sown in the autumn. That, if you were to have to delay your sowing date till maybe the latter stages of October, you're going to have the right soil type and free draining type soil in order for that crop to get up and going and get a good plant stand.
Okay. Tom, just from your point of view, and we might finish up now with another question or two after this, but question here around regional differences north versus south in terms of the winter malting that you would have taken in. Did you have much down south, and was there anything that you could see coming over the weighbridge that they were a bit different?
Not really, to be honest with you, Michael. We looked through the figures. It's just such an unusual year this year. There was, I suppose, slightly higher protein levels as you went more north. That was about the only thing, but no, not from a quality point of view. Maybe yield-wise, as always, the reverse of normal. The yield actually improved as you came up north rather than in Wexford. Usually the spring barley is the opposite way around. So that's the only thing I noticed with it across all the samples.
Okay. And Tom, I'm going to ask you the sticky question, because there's always a sticky question in all these kind of ones. In terms of price, where do you see the price for the coming season, just in terms of, I suppose, farmers trying to plan and put in this crop?
Yeah, so we have asked the global person who looks after Pierre-Eric, who looks after the price, to come forward with a FOBCRE price for 22 harvest. So he's looking at that at the moment. If you go into the actual website, which I can't do, but he can do, I think at this minute in time, that price would be indicatively around 230, but that doesn't say that. I don't know where the offer will be, but that's at this minute. If you click on it, it could go down, it could go up. I don't know.
But pitched around the same price as spring malting barley, is that it?
The winter will be the same price as spring, no difference. Yeah.
All right, okay. Look, that's great. We were going to keep this webinar relatively short. We're just a little bit over, but I think it was well worth asking those questions. Tom, thanks very much. Richie as well, Eoin and John Crowley as well for his contribution for in the video as well. Look, it's great to get the insight into the market as Tom has given us from a farmer perspective and also from a research perspective. So look, it's great, and thanks very much for your contribution this morning. And certainly thanks for everyone who's after tuning in. As always, there's a good few people have tuned in this morning and have stayed with us right to the very end. Just for people who've tuned in, we're always anxious to hear about your experiences of the webinars so that we can improve for the future. So shortly, we're going to be sending out a quick survey to you. It takes about a minute or maybe 2 minutes at most to complete, and we really do appreciate your feedback on that. So before I go, I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the upcoming events locally. COVID, I suppose, has kept us all indoors over the last while. It has changed a bit, and now we're in the fortunate situation that we're now out on the ground and a good bit more, and we have a few meetings coming up. So for those meetings, you might just throw them up there, Dara. We have a couple of meetings coming up to do with the autumn management of winter sown crops, if you like. We have one this morning, which is too late for most of you down in Cork. But tomorrow we're in Donald McGrath's in Clonmel. On Wednesday we're in Simon Neville's in Wexford. On Thursday then we're in Tom Tierney's in Prosperous Kildare. All of the events start at 11 o'clock, apart from the one in Prosperous in Kildare, which starts at 3 o'clock. So we'll be chatting about autumn management of the crops, BYDV, weed control. We'll also talk about the use of organic manures and certainly the influence of the overall high prices of fertilizers as is looking forward to next year. And there's a few other issues as well then for each of the other for individual meetings as well. So they're in-person meetings. Come along. It's a great chance to get a little bit of information, meet your neighbours, and you know, it's a really good time of year, I suppose, to catch up a little bit. So with that, look, really thanks very much to again to Richie, John, Eoin, and Tom for the contribution today. Thanks everyone for attending, and look, I'm looking forward to meeting all of you in the crop meetings over the next week, and we'll have some more webinars coming up in the next couple of months. So with that, goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.